We're going to be going to the book of Esther, but again, I want to just stop just for a second in Daniel 2. And we always welcome people that are with us online. We'll have people that'll listen this week and somewhere down the road, and so we try to help include them into the things we're doing. Like I said, we'll read the first chapter as we go through class. I still think it's helpful just to kind of help us walk into what's going on. And as I've mentioned before, when I think of the end of the Old Testament, if you do a V that kind of starts here, because things are really pretty well straightforward all the way down through David, then you have the divided kingdom. And the further you go toward the end of the Old Testament, the greater variety both of people and personalities and events that take place. But tonight, we're going to start with, and again, we touched on this, in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And this dream startles him, it bothers him, and all the magicians and astrologers and everything say, oh, you tell us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation. And he says, no, you tell me the dream or I'm going to kill you. And so, thankfully, and this is, I always keep these two guys in mind, and I have like this big parentheses, God sends Joseph ahead of his people south into Egypt, and that's our opening of the Old Testament. And then in 606, as the first captives are carried away, God sends Daniel north to end up with the Babylonians and then the Persians. But at least Daniel had three friends. My heart goes out to Joseph, and I just try to imagine being 17 years old and stuck in some stinking prison somewhere, and some nights just going to sleep and thinking of those sorry brothers. And at some point, you have to give that up. I don't think that happened the first week. And a part of God's working with him and developing him was going through that. But here's Daniel, and he calls his three friends together. Okay, guys, we need to pray really hard about this because my life's in danger and all these other people. And then when God reveals the vision to him, so in Daniel 2, then he tells him, the God of heaven reveals these things, and this is the image, so I'm in verse 32. The head of this image was of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs are bronze, and its legs of iron, with feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And then he talks about this stones cut out with no human hand, and it strikes the image and breaks it into pieces. But I still want to drop down into verse 44 because in the midst of this vision that this wonderful, he starts as a young man, but by now we're getting older, and as we mentioned, I'm estimating he's somewhere between 85 plus when he's thrown in the lion's den, which is going to be even at a later time. But he tells the king, only God reveals these things. But as he's talking about the feet, both of iron and clay, which, as we've noticed, were going to be the Romans, he says, in the days of those kingdoms, the Lord is going to establish a kingdom which shall never be defeated, never be shaken, and will not be given to another. And this is one of those things that's easy to remember, and here's a part of just wonderful lessons growing up. I heard lessons, here's Acts 2, and the prophecies of the king. Let me do it this way. Here's Acts 2, and the prophecies of the kingdom are going to be specifically in Joel 2, in Isaiah 2, and in Daniel 2. And it's just amazing, just as our Bibles work out, that these men at different stages of time give these very clear predictions and prophecies. The Lord is going to establish a kingdom, and different translations will say it in different ways. This one will just say, which shall never be destroyed, nor shall its sovereignty be left to another. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Where's the Babylonian Empire today? Where's the Roman Empire today? And when you see people who've gone to places like Ephesus, once the Temple of Artemis, which was one of the seven wonders of the world, and I still just kind of hold my head when I think about this, you could put virtually three of the Acropolises in Athens inside the temple of Diana or Artemis in Ephesus. And if you can just imagine how big the temple is in Athens, it's just kind of hard for us to comprehend. And this was one of the 7 wonders of the world. Once the thing was destroyed, a lot of material was taken off to build churches, but it was buried, and it took centuries to even find the temple. And so when they finally found it, then they pieced together one column that they found parts of, and a bird sits on the top and has built a nest on top of this column. And in the first century, here was one of the 7 wonders of the world, and all these people are, doing images to God, whether it's Diana's the Roman or Artemis, the Greek side. And this was just kind of the big focus. And I look at that single column and I say, okay, where's the worship of Artemis today? Everything that's earthly, everything that's political will someday come to an end in one way or another. But, and this is so important, all of the references to the church before Acts 2 in the Gospels are always in the future. On this rock I will give you the keys of the kingdom. I will build my church. And after Acts 2, the descriptions of the kingdom are always either a present or a reality. Hebrew writer, having received a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let's worship God. And what we're going to see tonight is that we're just going to pass through this very quickly, but just keep those images of those kingdoms in mind. And as we said earlier, the early ones are in alphabetical order. The Assyrians are not a part of the vision. They're previous to this, but we'll just quickly notice them. And then we're going to come to the Babylonians, sometimes called Chaldeans, but if you see BC, they're the same group. And then the Medes and the Persians are next. And before we finish tonight, the Persian Empire is finally going to be conquered by Alexander. And from 331 down into the 60s will be a Hellenistic, the Greek part, and that's going to be the middle part of the statue. And then our New Testament is going to actually be the feet. Let's do this quick review. And like I said, there's some people who are never in the same classes, and so we're not going to spend long on this. But here's just some very significant single events that kind of take us toward the end of the Old Testament. The first one is, and again, there's many, but I just did some highlights. In 721, Assyria conquers the northern 10 tribes of Israel, deports them, takes them all away, and eventually they allow a few to come back. They intermarry, and those who actually survived are the Samaritans. And when we did this last week, we noticed our prophet Isaiah, he prophesies from 740 to 700, right in the middle of his prophecies. And you stop and think, if there were 12 of us and now there's 2, we've always had this buffer zone, even though we've had struggles with the northern kingdom. And then after 721, we're so much more vulnerable because we're fewer in number, we're more isolated. And then we have this growing mixed group of people above us, and a lot of uncertainty develops after that. We're going to drop down to 612 and notice the Babylonians and Chaldeans, same group. And this time the Medes are going to conquer Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria. So there's our A, there's Assyria, and I should have put that in bold. But if you remember Jonah, and it's going to be roughly 150 years earlier, was sent to Nineveh. And when I'm doing this with my small children, we do sound-alikes. The prophet Nahum writes to Nineveh. So you can hear N in Nahum is going to write to Nineveh and just talk about their coming destruction. And so the bulk of it was done in 612, and you'll see prophecies again in Nahum. Zephaniah 2:13 through 15 will say Nineveh will become a pasture for flocks. And the same type thing. Assyria terrorized the ancient world from the mid-900s down through 612. And by the time we come to the next event in 606, the ancient world arises and exterminates the whole nation. So after 606, you can't virtually find an Assyrian. The ancient world rose up and they just wiped them out. Sorry, this is gross. There were times that Assyrians captured a city and they would start a pile of heads, a pile of feet, and a pile of hands. They would just decapitate people and just kind of for the scare effect would do that. One of the Assyrian kings captures the upper part of Egypt, and they virtually surrendered, but then he goes 500 miles down into Egypt just to kill another group of people, and you think, that's like marching from here to Memphis just to kill people. So once the Assyrians were overcome, like I said, the ancient world just rose up and literally wiped them out. And so in 606, here's the final group, Nebuchadnezzar, who's going to be rising with the Babylonians. Pharaoh Necho is going to come up from Egypt, and this is one of those tragic events. The last and one of the really, really good kings of Israel was Josiah. And Josiah foolishly went out to keep Necho from going up to engage in this battle, and he was killed, and then the rest of the kings of Judah are going to be bad. But by 606, the Assyrian Empire is gone. And like I said, for 300 years, they had been basically the most powerful, feared force in the ancient world. Well, the next group are going to be the Babylonians, and primarily the rule of Nebuchadnezzar. And these are the three times that he captures Jerusalem. 606 is the first time, and that's when Daniel's carried off into captivity. They wait for a while. There's another type of rebellion. He comes back 598, 97, captures the city again. Ezekiel, the prophet of the people, he's carried off into captivity. They foolishly revolt again, and the third time he says, okay, we're just going to burn the place down. And so all the destruction of the city and the walls that we've been looking at earlier with Nehemiah coming to rebuild, all of that is going to be destroyed in that latter one. And so between 587 to 586, then Babylon captures Jerusalem and it's finally destroyed. While all this is taking place, Cyrus the Great, and you'll see his dates are 559 to 530, the first thing they do is that they conquer the Medes, which are kind of like a fellow tribe. And these initially were small tribal areas, and basically think Iran and Iraq, which will give you some context for where they are. And so Cyrus the Great conquers his neighbors, the Medes, and sometimes they shared, sometimes they competed, but they'll virtually be called the Medes and the Persians after Cyrus does this. And in 539, and sorry, I always do it at 539, we have the handwriting on the wall. Do you remember in the book of Daniel? They're having the feast, and this hand comes out and writes on the wall, and the interpretation is mene, tekel, parsin. You've been weighed and found in the balance and wanting. And that night, the Babylonian Empire fell. So what the Persians did is that they went upstream, did a series of locks and dams and things, and the Euphrates River flowed through Babylon, and they just diverted the river completely around the city, and no one had ever thought to do something like that. And so when they put all the locks in place, the river just went shoo and went around the city, and they just marched into places where the river had been unopposed. And Belshazzar was killed that night. The whole kingdom fell. And so just overnight in 539, the Babylonian Empire was conquered. Then, and I noticed this about Cyrus, when you read Isaiah, and again, 150 years earlier, 44:28 into 45, then God predicts that Cyrus will be, and the first one is, he's my anointed one, which is even still hard for us as Christians to read because that's the words for Saul and David and prophets. But here's a statement. This foreign king is going to be my specific chosen one, and he will be my shepherd, and he will send people back to Jerusalem. So the people who'd been carried off by Babylonian captivity, and again, if you subtract 606 from, well, let's do it the other way, 536 from 606, 70 years. And the prophet Jeremiah had said twice very specifically, oh, when the 70 years are completed. And I still love this. Daniel's in captivity. And again, here he is as an old man. And somehow he has a copy of the book of Jeremiah. And here he is. And he knows when the city was first taken because that's when he was carried into captivity. And so he reads from Jeremiah, and you'll see this in 25 and 29, the captivity is going to last 70 years, and so he calculates the dates, and he knows when God's going to send the people back. So what does God do? God causes the empire collapse of the Babylonian Empire, and they fall in 539. And within 3 years, Cyrus the Great says, go home. And just exactly like God had prophesied earlier, then the captives came back through the rise and the fall of the kingdoms. And so, in 539, Babylon falls to the Persians. What's interesting about Cyrus is that his father was a Persian, his mother was a Mede, and because of having that influence and that background, then they basically consolidated the kingdom. And I asked Temple to give us this map. Look at how vast the Persian Empire was. It's going to be spread both through Darius and Xerxes are going to be a part of this. But if you go all the way to India, go south into Egypt and over to the west, they conquer all of Turkey and Asia Minor, and then they're going to have the initial part over on the top, and we're going to see about when they tried to capture Greece in a little bit. But look at how vast this is. Comparatively, the Assyrians and the Babylonians had been more within the Tigris-Euphrates River, and so the Persians are going to be the first truly international kingdom. And when we start reading in the book of Esther, we're going to be coming across, 127 districts, provinces, satraps, whatever the term your translation is. And here's this vast, vast international kingdom. And the Assyrians, like they did with the northern 10 tribes, they capture you, they carry people off. Babylonians come along, they capture you, as they did Jerusalem, they carry you off. The Persians come in and they say, go home. Everybody who wants to, go home. And so that's why by the time the Babylonians fall in 539, within 3 years, Cyrus, who's predicted to be the anointed shepherd of the Lord, says to, and it's not just God's people, but he says to other nations, if you want to go home, go home. Can I use our terminology, okay? The Persians basically say, go home, pay your taxes, don't join into any rebellions, take care of your own business. We're going to give you a lot of kind of self-control, and as long as you pay your taxes and you're loyal to the empire, run your own business. Well, how different is that from being packed up and carried off hundreds of miles to live in another country where you don't know the language, you don't know the people and everything else? And so because they sent all of these people back home, then they were able to have, well, and let me say it this way. The exiles who come back to Jerusalem, they have a commitment to maintain the peace because that's allowed them to come home. Why do they want to rebel against the empire that allowed them to come back to their homeland and to reestablish themselves? And so the exiles, like I said, in 536 are going to return to Jerusalem, and you'll see the prophecies both in Jeremiah 25 and 29. I put these in bold. In terms of dates, our book of Esther is going to take place earlier than Ezra and Nehemiah. And let me just do this real quick, again, just for kind of a memory thing. Our last three books of history, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, all take place after the fall of Jerusalem, and the last three of our minor prophets also take place during that time. And so if you notice, and we'll come to this in a second, Esther is from 483 to 473. Kenny, if the outlines are gone, there's some on that other table if y'all want to get one. That'll just help you to follow along. Appreciate you guys being here. And so Esther, in terms of history, actually happens before the others, but in our Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah are first, and then Esther's there. When we looked at Ezra, he's the scribe, and remember in 7:10, he set his heart to study, to do, and to teach the law of the Lord. And Ezra goes back with a group of people. They begin a revival, and they had started building on the temple. They've had all kinds of complications, all kinds of things happen. And the two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, on the right-hand side, rise up and say, let's rebuild the temple. And you stop and think, well, why is the temple so important? Well, that's where we have the Passover. That's where we do Pentecost. That's where we do the Day of Atonement. And they would have had some type of structure, some tent or something, but they didn't have the temple. And so both with Ezra's encouragement and then with the encouragement of Haggai and Zechariah, then the temple's rebuilt. And again, I didn't write this down, but you can do it very quickly. The temple's destroyed in 586. They start building, it stops, it stalls, and then they start again, and the temple's completed in 516. So math people, you subtract 516 from 586, and guess what you get? 70 years. And so both from the destruction of the temple to the time it's rebuilt, from the time the first captives are taken until they come back, both are going to be 70 years. I'm sorry, you can obviously tell I'm a firm believer in prophecy, and that's why, and sorry, I just have to shake the chills down. I'm in a class on Daniel, Macquarie University. Our teacher's, I don't know if he's an atheist, but he's not a believer. And we read some things from Daniel, we read some of these other things, and he says, this is how we know that these things had to be written down after the event, because they are so carefully and clearly given. They could only have been written after the event because they tell about the event so carefully. And I'm saying, inspiration, Holy Ghost. Holy men of God spake as they were borne along by the Holy Spirit. None of the world religions have predictive prophecy that was fulfilled. And we're not even touching all the prophecies about Jesus. And so even as the people are struggling, and I think of it this way, in spite of their faithlessness, over and over and again, God demonstrates his faithfulness, and through the prophets will announce this is what's going to take place. And that's why when I do prophets, two words come to mind, F-O-R-T-H, they will speak forth, thus says the Lord. Go back to the law of Moses. They constantly speak that way. And through the Spirit, they will F-O-R-E, foretell. Both things are going to happen in the immediate future, but it's amazing how many things they prophesy about the coming of Jesus. So Nehemiah comes back the first time in 444. He stays for a number of years and then comes back, but during that time they rebuild the wall. And for those who weren't here, it's still amazing. The wall's 40 feet high, 8 foot wide, and is a circumference around the city, and it's wide enough and big enough that the last kind of time of praise and worship, they actually walk around the walls to get there. And what hadn't been done in 142 years, the people finish in 52 days. Most people put the book of Malachi close to the end, somewhere in the late 400s. The events in Malachi are very similar to Nehemiah and the things that are going on. So we're just going to touch on these Persian kings. Not going to give a lot of detail to any of them because I'll show you where they fit into the reading of Esther. When you start with Cyrus the Great, and again, encourage you to go back and look at that. And if you mark in your Bible, end of Isaiah 44, opening of 45, God calls him Cyrus, and very specifically 150 years before he comes along. And so he's the ruler from 559 to 530. And unlike the Babylonian Empire, once Nebuchadnezzar died, the kingdom just kept going downhill. But by Cyrus, and it wasn't this big only during the time of Cyrus, they kept adding to it. But by having all of these people go back to their home territory, have them live basically in some type of peace, like I said, pay your taxes, don't rebel, don't revolt. Then when you look at the pink color of the map, this is a huge, huge kingdom, and I like to refer to it as the first international world empire. Like I said, when you do Assyrians and Babylonians, think Tigris, Euphrates, and mostly that area, and the Persians just kept extending and extending, and a part of what's going to take place with Xerxes, who I believe is the king in Esther, is that we're going to see a time where that actually failed and stopped. I just listed major ones. There's a couple in between that are only in for a short time. There's Cambyses, 530 to 522. Darius the Great, again, expanded the empire. He was another one of those great conquerors. And as they kind of consolidated in different areas, it's like they caught their breath, and then they spread out a little bit further and a little bit further. In Esther 1:1, and if you have the book of Esther, the Hebrew name that will be given to the king is going to be Ahasuerus. But the common conviction is that this is going to be the king that's known, at least especially in Greek writing, as Xerxes. So give me just a second to get there. So as Esther opens, it will say, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. And the general consensus is, in terms of just looking at the kings as they're listed in the Persian order, this is going to be Xerxes the Great. And he's going to be the king throughout the book of Esther. And so if you'll notice, he is going to reign from 486 to 465. And then when you look up at the book of Esther, which I underline, the events in the book of Esther are going to take place roughly from 483 to 473. So what we're going to have in the book of Esther is like a snapshot of some events that take place in the court of the most powerful ruling empire in the world for 200 years. And all the events that take place are going to be there, and we'll kind of come to that in just a second. There's two things, and we're going to slip into Greek history because the significance of this. If you'll notice on the map, everybody knows where Turkey and Asia Minor is. And the Persians had gone across into Europe and that upper area of Thrace into Macedonia. Then at some point they conquered and they ruled that. But two events happened, one with Darius and the second with Xerxes, where then they tried to go down and conquer the city of Athens and Sparta. And you'll come across familiar things that are both in terms of history and movies and other things as we go through this. The first one is 490. Okay? So anticipate Xerxes isn't going to rule until 486. But in 490, in history it's called the Battle of Marathon. And the Persians had this huge navy, which we're going to come to again in the next one. And what takes place is that if you know where Ephesus is on the west coast of Turkey, west coast of Asia Minor, firstly, all of the settlements across from Greece and all the islands in between are all Greek colonists. So they virtually all speak Greek, and so the Persians had conquered Asia Minor and Turkey, but as far as the Athenians and the Spartans were concerned, it's kind of like they've conquered their first cousins. And so all the people on the western side of Turkey, Ephesus, Pergamum, all those areas that we know from the New Testament, then those were settled from people originally from the homeland. And so your Greek culture is going to extend not only just in Greece, but all through those islands in the Aegean and very deep into Asia Minor is going to have a heavy, heavy Greek influence. So what the Persians did was that they got their navy together and they landed a large force of people to the northeast of Athens. So they invaded Greece by ship. And so if you'll notice, the Persians had started as a small tribe. They became this uniting force. And so in 490, Darius, who's the king before Xerxes, sent a Persian army to punish the Athenians because they had been supporting the Greek islands along the coast of Asia Minor and were revolting against Persia. So on that far western boundary of the Persian Empire, Athens has been contributing, fermenting, helping the islands, trying to get their freedom. And the Persians say, okay, this is it. And they land this huge force just up from Athens. So if you have the outline, it's 1-1. The Persian invaders are estimated at about 30,000. And they were met and defeated with about 10,000 Greeks. And what they took place, they did the battle lines. The Greeks left their heavy armed forces, and they actually surrounded them from the back and won this amazing victory. And they eventually broke through and they killed the Persians. Leslie, half marathon? How far have you run? Half marathon. Okay, how come we know that a marathon is 26 miles? Well, Philippides is going to run 26 miles from the Battle of Marathon, the plain of Marathon, to Athens to deliver the news, we won. And so the reason that the marathon is 26 miles today is that this was the distance between the city of Athens and the plain of Marathon where the battle was formed. Some of you may have known that. I'm sure there's a lot of people who run the marathon have no idea that that's exactly what took place. And that's still quite a feat. And I think some of these guys even had armor on. I'd want to peel down. I don't want any armor on if I'm going to try to do something like that. But this is a day of good news, and they won the victory. You're outnumbered 3-1. The Persians are going to retreat for a while. And then if you notice this, the journey of Philippides from Marathon to Athens inspired the first Boston Marathon, April 19th, 1897. So this is a huge part of the racing culture, not only just in the States and other places, but this is where this took place. And so this is the king before Xerxes. They do the invasion to punish them. They get defeated. They're kind of licking their wounds, and they're gathering forces together, and they're saying, okay, the day's going to come back when we're going to get our revenge. So notice what happens next. If you have the outline, it's the next page. They're going to return 10 years later. But this time, rather than doing a small land force, they're going to come across the top of the Hellespont, come into that upper area, like where Paul went across for Philippi, Thessalonica, those places on the missionary journey. And this is going to be a massive army with this huge fleet. And so they are going to go and punish the Athenians and revenge the loss that they had. But here's something else, and we typically don't think about this. Because of not having everything from tents to equipment and everything else, most of the battles in the ancient world were fought in the spring and into the fall, and they either overwintered or they did something else. And when the Spartans are going to sacrifice themselves at Thermopylae, what's going to take place is that the longer that the Greeks can keep them, and there's this huge army, and the clock's ticking as it gets closer and closer to the fall, then even though they're smaller in number, they have an advantage. But notice what takes place. 490, Xerxes planned a much larger invasion with a naval force. And what takes place, and this is 2:2, the Persians are going to build a bridge. They're going to connect these little boats together, tie them together. And one of the things that I read is that it took 3 to 5 days to get the army across. So you just stop and think, how many men is that going to be? And so they're going to take the generals and the kings and everything. But, and this is always one of those interesting things, they got all of the stuff built, a storm came up, and Xerxes, being the modest individual that he is as a Persian king, is upset, and he sends soldiers down to brand the sea with a hot iron and to give it lashes with a chain for being disrespectful and for destroying the bridge. And I'm sure the sea was just trembling when that took place. And that just gives you something about the mindset. You know, for us today, we're thinking, who on earth sends someone down, but, okay, go down with a chain and beat the sea because she's been rebellious for doing this. And that will kind of give you a picture of who the guy is that's going to be in the book of Esther. They reconstruct, they rebuild the bridge, they go across. And so in 2:3, a huge Persian force was moving along the coast, and the record said they drank all the water in sight and they devoured anything that was edible. This is these are thousands of soldiers. They have some supplies from the ships, and there were several Greeks initially, but the heart of it was 300 Spartans, and they just said, here's this narrow pass at Thermopylae, and we're gonna hold them there. There was a group of Persians called the Immortals, and they always numbered 10,000. When 1 or 2 died or something, they did that. And as one of our Greek history teachers says, the Spartans mortalized the Immortals. And they were in this narrow pass. And finally, a traitor told the Persians, oh, there's a goat trail around the top, and it'll take you a day or so to get all the way around. But if you'll send troops around, then you can finally surround them because they're in the pass. And when the Spartans realized that the trap was coming, they told basically the rest of the Greeks, go home, defend the homeland. And if you see the movie 300 Spartans, the 300 Spartans said, we're going to stay. Sorry. And when they selected the guys to come, the number one requirement was that every one of them had to have a son. So Kelly, what does that tell you? They're not expecting to come back. So ladies, how do you tell him goodbye for the last time? And so these group of guys decided, at the cost of our lives, we're going to go to Thermopylae and we're going to defend the pass as long as we can. And finally, when they were surrounded, the Persians sent word to the Spartans and said, you need to surrender because the arrows will be so thick it will blot the sun out. And being Spartans, they said, that's fine, we can fight well in the shade. And so the 300 Spartans then took their stand, were eventually killed, but some estimates are that they killed maybe up to 10,000 Persians. But what's the deal? They slowed them down, slowed them down, slowed them down. The clock is ticking, and that puts more pressure on the Persians because they need to get this done before the late fall and the winter is going to come. When you look at 2:3, the entire city of Athens gets on ships and abandons. The Persians burn the city of Athens. Then they have a battle, it's called Plataea, and the Spartans, and especially the Athenians, defeat a huge Greek force again on land. And then there's a naval battle called Salamis. And the Persians were so much larger. If you look just before number 3, the Greek is going to lose about 40 ships in the battle, and the Persians are going to lose 200 ships. 50,000 people are killed. And what the Greeks did in the sea battle is that the Persian ships were bigger, but the Greeks had the smaller ones. They actually trapped them in a small area, and they rammed a whole bunch of the Persian ships and sank them and then killed as many as they could. And finally, and this is kind of bizarre, Xerxes is setting up on this throne on the hill to watch this slaughter of the Greeks. And it was just this enormous defeat. And so the survivors then make the long trip back, and then they go back home. Now, what we're going to see is that when you read the book of Esther, we're going to be introduced to Esther. She's going to become the queen earlier. And then there's going to be about a 3 or 4 year gap. And then the story of Esther is going to take up again. Most people feel like, and this isn't spoken about in the book of Esther, but the gap is going to be Xerxes then leaving Persia, traveling all the way across Asia Minor, leading the troops across the Hellespont, trying to conquer Athens. And they did initially, but they lost the land battle, they lost at the sea, and the survivors then went back. And so when he comes back into the book of Esther later, then all of these events have taken place, but it's not mentioned and given for us in the book. Classical Athens is roughly from 460 to 430. They formed the Athenian League, and they said, we surrendered our city, we sacrificed it, it was burnt, you pay taxes. And so all of the buildings, the Parthenon, all those glorious buildings in ancient Athens were built by the money that came in. And at a point, the Spartans said, okay, we're sick of this. They start the Peloponnesian War in 431, and they fight off and on for 20 or 30 years, and they defeat the Greeks in Athens. But just notice, and then we're going to turn the page to Esther. During this time, the first thing is, the first Olympics are 770 BC. But then during this period of time, look at all the things that took place that are the foundations for so many different disciplines. History, Herodotus and Thucydides, right during this time. Philosophy, Socrates, Plato. The primary poet was Homer. And in the Greek world, Homer was the Bible of the ancient world before our Bible is written and put together. There's 3 playwriters, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. And then even in medicine, there was a god called Asclepius, and he was the dispenser of healing. Excuse me, give me half a second. And there were temples to Asclepius in all major cities in the Greek world. And if you were sick, you went and spent the night in the temple. There were some medical things provided, but then people wondered, would you get a vision or a dream or get healing? But also from this, the most famous doctor in the Greek world was and I always struggle with the accent. You said how do you say it? Hippocrates. Get the right accent there. Do people still take so when you come across the oath, some medical schools will give you the entire oath. Some will give the Reader's Digest version, first do no harm. But the Hippocratic Oath that you'll see, and the symbol with the snake and all those other things, then all those things developed this time. So basically kind of our foundations for history, for philosophy, for medicine, and for all these things that are a part of our society today, from this 460 to 430, then this is where most of these are going to have their foundation and their roots. And so especially in a Western culture, then these things are still a major part of our society today, and they take place after they defeated the Persians. Okay, Esther 1. In the days of Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia, he sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel. And Susa is going to be the winter capital. It is so hot in the summer, it's just amazing. All kinds of records are in the ancient world about just the extreme heat. So this is going to be the winter residence. So if you'll notice, the third year of his reign, he gave a feast. And he showed the riches of his glory. You'll see that. It's going to last half a year. And this is just kind of hard to comprehend. When those days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the palace. And then he gives all these descriptions of the curtains and the surroundings that were there. People drank out of golden vessels. They were all of different kinds. Royal wine was there. There was no restrictions. And Queen Vashti gave a feast for the women in the palace. On the seventh day, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he commanded, and there's 7 of these guys, the 7 eunuchs, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was lovely to look at, and she refused to come. So think about this. This is the guy who has branded the sea and lashed it with a chain. So you can kind of tell he's a real stable, 2 feet on the ground type of guy. And when you read this expression, he was enraged and his anger burned within him. Well, I'm sure most of us approve of this way. Ladies, it doesn't matter if you're beautiful or not. Do you really want to go parade in front of a whole bunch of drunks? I mean, seriously. The party's been going on for half a year, celebration, and then all of a sudden they've opened the keg and all the drinking's taking place. And I have to wonder as well, how sober is the king while all this is going on himself? And so we're not given any explanation, we're not given any motives, but what the writer of the story does do is he kind of goes through, you kind of look at that and you think, okay, I can understand from her point of view why she doesn't want to become a part of that. We're not told what she would have to wear. The only thing we're told is a crown. And you just have to wonder, and what else does that mean? And for whatever her reasons are that we're not given, I'm very empathetic when I say politely refuses, and he just blows a fuse. He just gets totally enraged. So, we're down in verse 13. He said to the wise men who were versed in the law what should be done, and according to the law, what should be done to the queen. She hasn't performed the command. And they go through all of this, and what they say in verse 19, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the law of the Medes and the Persians, it can't be repealed. She's never again to come before Ahasuerus. And so, can I use the word demoted? I don't know if you use the word fired, but anyway, she is demoted from that. We won't get to all this tonight. We'll just touch on it again next week. If you're given this kind of advice to the queen, you want to make sure she doesn't come back and become queen again. And so a part of this is, one, no longer is she to be the queen, but she's also never to come back, because what happens if the queen comes back and you're one of the 7 advisors? That's not going to be good for you. And so you can see a part of why they do this is, one, to get her deposed, and so that she'll never come back. And so a petition is sent to find someone who is better, and the proclamation's made throughout the kingdom. And you'll see in verse 21, it pleased the king and the princes, and he sent letters to the royal provinces, to every people in their language, that every man will be the master of his house and speak the language of his people. And that's how the whole story begins of how Esther's going to be eventually selected to be the queen. So we'll do highlights and I'll leave a lot of this to you to read. We're in the winter capital, and you'll notice Esther 1 and 2, the 3rd year, Esther 2:16, the 7th year. See what I'm saying? And that's where most people think this is when the failed Greek invasion is going to take place. I'll save the other events and we'll just touch on some of these things next year, except I want to go down to the very bottom if you look at number 9. A part of what's going on with the events with Vashti the queen is that Xerxes is getting all of these people together. The invasion is underway in terms of process. And here's the irony. How can a king order and command an army if his own wife doesn't listen to him? And I'm looking at this from the advisor's point of view. And so the reason we need to make an example of her is that behind the scenes, what's going on? Do you look up at the top? 1, 2, the 3rd year. We're going to pick up the story in 2:16 in the 7th year. So during that intermediate time, a part of the reason why I think the king is so furious at her is that he's about to be the man, he's about to be the commander-in-chief. And what is the irony? How do you obey the commands of a guy whose wife won't even listen to him? Which doesn't put the king in a very good light. Here's the last thought. When you look at Proverbs 31, it's not wise for kings to drink wine. Proverbs 21, wine is a mocker. And we'll touch on a couple of things, but look at this. What an irony. The king's decree throughout the empire that women are to be submissive to their husbands was not being followed in his own palace. And I just think a little bit of an irony is in that. So if you read ahead, we'll pick up chapter 2. We'll mention some other things just briefly that happened, but Lord willing, we'll pick up with that and follow our story from there, Lord willing, next week. Thank you.